So I'll leave you in the capable hands of Craig, and then you'll hear from me again once I've looked at all of your wonderful questions as they come through the app. Thanks very much.
Excellent, thanks, Luke. And the topic that we've got this afternoon is diverse partnership driving quality. Now, clearly that's a broad topic, so is the definition and application of the term quality. So for the purpose of this dialogue, what we're going to use is the notion of quality in terms of the range of options available in a post-school environment, whether that be for school leavers or whether it be for international students even, plus adults who may well be needing to come back into post-school education context. Now, it's an interesting environment that we're in at the moment. I've often said for a government going into election with very little policies around vocational education and higher education, it is amazing the amount of reviews that are underway at this particular point in time. So what we do have around the traps, which is possibly an indication that there is general concern in the community and certainly within the political layer that maybe things are not quite right in terms of the alignment in our post-school world. What are some of those reviews? We heard yesterday from Peter Coldrake about the review of provider category standards, and his review was essentially saying we've got a strongly bifurcated system and we need more dynamism within it. We've also had Glenn Davis in recent times saying, well, in fact, we've got probably the largest set of universities in Australia compared to global standards. And then, of course, we've had the Joyce review of the vocational education and training sector, where he has very strongly indicated that the funding model should start to align. But then some of the other policies that he recommends further entrenches the VET way of doing things, which actually makes that an even harder pathway to achieve. Tian, as Minister for Education, Higher Education, is encouraging universities to engage with community and industry. The two regulators operate on very different remits and operating models. The Prime Minister and First Ministers have all been saying that VET should be treated on the same basis as university, and then in the next breath the Prime Minister shifts the vocational education and training sector to a different portfolio within the federal government. So, what was a high degree of difficulty in terms of what are some ways of bringing the sector together becomes even more difficult when we think about the environment that we're operating in. Nevertheless, it is still a live topic, primarily for many of you in this room, of course, as well as for our community as well. So to get the ball rolling, what we're going to do is to hear from Elizabeth about the Monash Commission. That was essentially, well, I'll allow Elizabeth to introduce that. But that was really tackling this question of how do we integrate or bring together the post-school environment. And then after that, we're going to hear from William, primarily around how do universities engage both with community, industry and the like. So the first speaker, I'll hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, and good afternoon, everyone. I think that the Monash Commission, which the Vice-Chancellor, Margaret Gardner, asked me to chair at the beginning of 2018, is a good example of the sort of thing that you were talking about at your conference over these few days, and that is partnerships. So she asked me to chair it, and I said, well, I've been to a few universities, but I'm not a higher education person, and she said that's exactly what I want. And the commission that we established was myself as a business background, one other person, Meta Shephers, who's a strategist and a business person. We had Murray Person, former head of TAFE in New South Wales. We had Ian Chubb, former chief scientist and Vice-Chancellor of ANU. Rory Hume, former UNSW Vice-Chancellor and now at Utah. And former Vice-Chancellor at Warwick University, Nigel Thrift. So a good mix from all across the sector, but with two people, Meta and myself, who could ask the dumb questions, and we did. We spent time commissioning papers. They're all available on the website. We spent a lot of time with students. We spent time at a symposium talking to people, listening to people from across the sector. And we produced our report in May this year, and I just want to go through a couple of the issues. We set ourselves the task of writing a short report, and anybody who knows, who's written hundreds and hundreds of pages, and I'm sure that's most of you in the room, know how difficult it is to write a short report. And we wanted to make short, practical, but not necessarily easily implementable politically recommendations. And so we looked at a couple of key issues for the sector, and we said there were 5 key challenges that needed to be addressed, and I think even though only 6 months has passed, it's still true. We said, and I think Craig's alluded to this, the post-compulsory system needs to be more stable and unified, better able to pursue diverse missions, and you all have diverse missions in education and across the training providers in both vocational and higher education. We said that more needs to be done to remove the structural impediments that still prevent too many talented Australians from accessing post-compulsory education, i.e. people in lower socio-economic backgrounds, people in rural and regional Australia and Indigenous Australians. We said the sector needs to be more agile and permeable, delivering opportunities for lifetime learning to meet the demands of rapid economic and social change. The system needs greater capacity to respond to technological disruption. And last but by no means least, we need to fix the funding. And the funding model that still exists for post-compulsory education and training today lacks the coherence and, I would argue, the ambition for the times in which we live. So out of that, and I'm very much condensing a almost 15-month period, we said 3 recommendations, none of which I have to say has been implemented. That probably won't be much of a surprise to people in this room. Establish a statutory agency for post-compulsory education and training. That is, a single independent of government statutory agency to be established for vocational education and training and for higher education. In a previous life, I was Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria, had the pleasure or otherwise of attending various COAG meetings in that time, and I know with that hat on just how difficult that recommendation is, but we still put it, we still believe it's very important. Recommendation 2, introduce a universal learning entitlement and a lifetime learning account. To do this will enable all Australians to learn, train and reskill as their needs and circumstances change. And the third one, to design a coherent, sustainable model of financing public providers. This is put forward to realise the diverse missions of post-compulsory education and training and to strengthen the resilience of the sector. Now, I'm very much in the time available condensing our report. It's available on the website, and I commend it to you if there's interest. And I just want to close my comments for now with a personal reflection. When I was preparing for this panel, I looked back on all of the experiences that we had as a group of people, meeting remotely, meeting face-to-face, meeting with people in the sector. And one of the things that struck me as the difference between my experiences at Sydney, La Trobe and Melbourne universities, which I attended as a student, and some of the students we spoke to, as I went to Sydney University as my first university from Wollongong. I was the only one in my class who was at least at Sydney University. This is in 1970. And talk to students today, especially kids who come from regional and rural areas to universities in Melbourne. And they talked about the loneliness of being from a remote regional place where they knew nobody else, and said, we're sitting in a lecture theatre or out on the lawn with hundreds of others, and everybody's on their phone and everybody's on their iPad, and the loneliness that they felt. And what struck me was we are better connected in theory than we have ever been, but those devices get in the way of those social interactions. what we were forced to do, no mobile phones, no devices. You had to queue up to use the public phones if you wanted to phone anybody, and then of course they had to be at home or in the office to take your call. These kids have got all of those devices, and yet we haven't yet found ways of connecting people, especially those for whom higher education is a struggle. And I thought it was interesting that when I was reflecting, because it's a while since I've reconnected with this, that was one of my major takeouts from it, that we've fixed a lot of things, but we haven't necessarily fixed our connection with each other. I will leave it at that, Craig.
Excellent, thanks Elizabeth. On that note, let's now move to a specific view about permeable universities, and we'll allow William to expand on that.
Thanks, Craig. So I want to kind of look at the key words in the title of this session, partnership, and a little bit on quality. And what I'm going to say is inspired by the publication just a few hours ago, actually, of this manifesto. There are a lot of if you follow events in the UK, you'll realise there are a lot of manifestos being published at the moment. This is one is about the election. This actually comes out of University of Lincoln and the Vice Chancellor, Mary Stewart, Professor Mary Stewart, who's set up an international lab, which I was part of. And this manifesto is about the purpose of universities in the 21st century, and it's called The Permeable University. And I've written a little piece in the Australian today, if you want to read a little bit more about it, and that's got a link to the online version of the manifesto. So I suppose what we were talking about has its roots in some criticisms of universities over the last few years for being somewhat arrogant, out of touch perhaps, part of the establishment, maybe even elitist, certain suspicion of experts, and there was a comment made in the Brexit referendum that we've had enough of experts, or we've heard enough from experts, that universities are awash with money, particularly referring to Vice-Chancellors' salaries and the amount of fee income we receive from international students, that we're out of step with popular sentiments and populist movements. That's led to disaffection and things like Brexit and the election of Trump and so on and so forth. So on partnerships, there's been, over the last few years, a reconsideration, I suppose, of universities' civic role and their engagement in their local communities and regions and relationships with their key stakeholders. And I suppose in a way what George was saying earlier this morning about disaffection among regions relates to this as well. I would want to add this caveat at this point, which is that this is not necessarily talking about all universities and all tertiary education institutions, because I think many regional universities and TAFE and VET institutions do this kind of thing very well. And many other universities could learn a lot from their experience and expertise in this area. And perhaps we need to highlight some case studies and some good practice in that. Anyway, so to the concept of permeability, I appreciate it's a little odd and unusual word to apply to universities, but the manifesto suggests that universities should adopt a more permeable approach to their activities, building stronger and more enduring relationships with their communities and the wider society. And permeability is offered as a new lens, if you like, through which to view the purpose of universities, reframing activities within universities as well as with their external partners. And it has implications for the core activities of universities, for education, for research, for engagement, and indeed for the way they are governed and for the national system in which they operate. So in terms of education, it's probably about working much more closely with all sectors of education, the education system, and building a real expectation of lifelong learning among our students, who will expect to have continuing relationships with educational institutions and educational activities. And actually, when they become alumni, want to provide experiences and opportunities for current students in their own workplaces. So building that expectation of lifelong learning throughout their working career. It's about breaking down the academic vocational divide, and it's also about rethinking the curriculum to take out colonial ideas and to introduce more indigenous knowledge and ways of thinking and perceiving things. In terms of research, I think it's really about thinking about the relationship between research and teaching in new ways, of actually encouraging students to do research and to prepare them better for new kinds of knowledge work. And we often talk about research-informed teaching. I'd like actually to talk about teaching-informed research, which is really about thinking about how you communicate complex ideas to a relatively less experienced audience, and using that experience to actually broadcast or actually communicate with audiences much more widely using social media if appropriate. And it's about interdisciplinarity, about thinking about, and this manifesto talks about or describes 10 grand challenges and the necessity for using an interdisciplinary approach to address these grand challenges. Actually, you won't be surprised by them, obviously climate change, inequality, conflict and so on. One of the grand challenges is a lack of vision and foresight, which is an interesting one to explore. So, recognising that we do need the sciences to understand some of these problems, particularly climate change, but we will need the human disciplines to actually solve them. Climate change is a good example, I think, at the moment. Then on engagement, which is where this idea of permeability really comes into its own, we're not really talking about knowledge transmission or knowledge exchange or research translation or commercialisation. The manifesto describes it as knowledge circulation, perhaps a better way of understanding the permeable university's activities in society. And the manifesto also talks about the importance of place and universities being embedded in their surrounding communities as well as in their national and global networks. And this means actually listening to their communities, learning from them rather than talking to them, or even worse, talking at them. You might have noticed that writers like Sally Clift in the Campus Morning Mail has written similarly about these kinds of things. She talks about connectedness, and she actually also refers to Peter Goldrick's review of provider category standards, that requirements related to industry engagement, civic leadership and community engagement should be introduced or bolstered in the university categories, the HE provider category standards. In the UK we have the introduction of the knowledge exchange framework alongside the research excellence framework and the teaching excellence framework, REF and TAFE, which wants to introduce metrics to measure these kinds of things. And we have the Times Higher Education global ranking of the impact of universities. I'm a bit sceptical about attempts to introduce metrics in this area and to fix and measure university activities. I'm also not wedded to the term permeability, connectedness. I think what we're talking about is building better, more enduring and more equal relationships with our partners. Which briefly brings me on to quality. I'll just say a few words about this. So in a sense, what are we building these relationships for? Surely it's more than just about bringing ourselves up to the standards, the threshold standards. It's more than just making incremental improvements in quality. Ultimately, isn't it about actually solving or addressing some of these grand challenges that the manifesto points out? And wouldn't this require actually some values, some kind of ethical basis to what we're trying to do? The manifesto talks about a values-based regulation of tertiary education or higher education in that case. And I'd like to explore what a values-based regulation would look like. And I assume it would be more than just about compliance and standards and about making a difference. It would be more about making a difference and actually addressing some of these grand challenges. So it's more than just a transactional exchange. It's about something that's transformational. Something that we aspire with our students to transform their ideas and their behaviour and so on, so that people collectively could begin to repair the effects of climate change, could achieve greater equality in our societies, and so that people don't see conflict as the only way to resolve differences of religion or opinion or affiliation. In conclusion, yes, we do need partnerships that can drive quality, but let's lift our heads a bit higher and build better relationships and bring people together to address and begin to resolve some of the grand challenges identified in the manifesto.
Good on you. Thanks, William. Now, I do need to remind you, while I make a couple of comments, there's opportunity for you to put your questions on the app. and some of them are coming through now, so we will make sure there is time for some questions, so please start generating them. Now, I have to confess I've just had a seniors moment, because whilst talking about what's going on in the UK, there was a report that was put out about 2 or 3 months ago, just before the election, that really looked at post-school options. And I really am having a seniors moment, but anyway, nevertheless, can you recall what it is?
The Philip Auger report?
The Auger report, that's it. That is a corker of a read if you really want to have a look at it. And the reason why I reckon it's a corker of a read is, okay, all right, we've outlined some positions here, but it actually has a bit of a reflection on what's going on in the opportunity for people post-school, based upon their opportunity and experience within school. And I would actually say there's a lot that we can learn from that as well. They actually point out our notion of the comprehensive schooling movement, and what we're doing in that space is still bifurcating opportunity for the for the English population. And I would argue that that's a very strong premise in Australia. That if we're not careful, we will go down that same path. And while Peter Shergold's doing a review on post-schooling pathway options, in some ways they've skipped the real question about what are we doing with senior school that gives a platform for going onwards. Thus ends the preaching element. I really want to make 2 quick points. My concern is, in the Australian context, that our supply side profile seems to be out of whack with the demand side of the labour market and the economy. Now, there is no doubt that most analysis shows that the professions and managers are going to grow. So there is always going to be that strong demand for clearly a higher education pathway in that area. But at the same time, all the data says that there's a lot of growth that's going to be in the intermediate occupational level, most of those prepared for within the vocational education and training space. And then when we think about globalisation, automation and the like, we know there's going to be a reskilling, re-education component that's probably going to impact both sectors. So I have 2 sort of points I want to make. The first one is, I fear that we are disappointing 2 cohorts of people. One is the bright-eyed university graduate who says, this is the career I'm heading towards, and their pathway into permanent full-time work seems to be getting longer and longer. And for vet graduates who are trained against a set of requirements determined and approved by industry, so let's face it, so industry can manage their workforces and wage costs. And there's no wonder that vet numbers have dropped. And it's not about funding, so let's not be caught out by governments have been withdrawing funding. It's fundamentally about the product. They're not meeting the aspiration of many young people wanting to do that. Now, I'm no doubt then going to be slapped around a bit by quite a number of people for saying that particular comment, but we've had a sector that's been dominated and run by industry. What's their motivation? Clearly it is about giving people opportunity through work. We all need work. But their base motivation is to be able to manage wage costs and the like. So we have to really, in a very fundamental way, deal with that. Here's my second point, is about why can't we, both in terms of TAFE and universities, higher ed and vet, work in partnership to solve some of these problems? And I want to go to 4 key points that the dual sectors put forward in a report they prepared in April. Which basically they said 4 very concrete things that could be done. Let's look at reform of the AQF, or surprise, surprise, that's sort of underway, and I would argue that we've really got to work hard to make sure that that review continues on its pathway. Second one is let's modernise vet qualifications and their development to focus on competencies on broad and future skills requirements. Third one, similar to the Monash Commission, let's try for a coherent funding framework for both higher ed and vet, and in also spanning the roles and responsibilities between the Commonwealth and states and territories. And let's extend the notion of work-based learning, which we often in the vet space call apprenticeship, but let's think about how do we systematise that in some particular way that it's an option in all post-school options or wherever it becomes relevant. Now, some of those clearly require government action, but there are two actually that I think that we could work towards, which really doesn't need government to come in. One, actually, believe it or not, under self-accrediting powers that universities have, why don't we look about some partnership around qualification design, and so that we can actually create something in the vet space that then can have really good progression and pathways into universities. And equally, we can do things around work-based learning opportunities. The notion that occupations are distinct and narrow, as in like we think about vet and higher ed are narrow, as in we think about in our rhetoric that industry is very narrow and structured, is really a thing of the 1970s, 1980s, and we just have to move over that and think about we need more fluid approaches. So I don't think it's about sectoral rivalries, although often that will come to mind. I actually think it's about we've got to look at brand new opportunities to bring more people into post-school opportunities. And I think it's really around making sure that there is equality of opportunity in a post-school setting where your opportunities are not compromised because of structural sort of rigidities between the two sectors. And I would well and truly admit on behalf of some of my members who may well be in the room, there is probably some tapes that are saying, well, hang on, chick, we've been pushed and battered around a bit. You want us to open up and collaborate? That's going to be a journey of trust and collaboration. But heck, if you think about the Coldrake review from a university perspective, where he's saying universities have got a key mission of opening up to community, industry and sort of civic engagement, what can be opening up to civic and community engagement if you jump around what TAFEs do? Because TAFEs are connected to community as well. Wouldn't it be a far more powerful outcome for all Australians, both in cities and regions, if there was some joined up way that we could do it? And by the way, we don't need Minister Tian, we don't need Minister Cash, we don't need your local state minister to be able to do it. We could do it by ourselves. So therein lies my challenge for us in terms of partnership. Thank you.
Question.